Next from Springfield, we sit down with Cinda Klickna, the president of the Illinois Education Association, and get her thoughts on education funding, the lack of teachers in Illinois, school choice, and what changes she would make to the education system. This runs about 40 minutes.
Cinda Klickna, thanks for joining us again on the Illinois Channel.
Thank you for having me.
It's been a while since we spoke, and as we tape this, you're on the downside and looking forward to actually leaving your job before too long, so we appreciate you taking the time to catch us up.
Thank you.
Between your teaching career and being in the IEA, you have kind of, as I understand it, moved in and out of the roles, but when did you start your career in education?
I started teaching in Springfield in 1973.
Wow.
And so it's been a long career at middle and high school, mainly high school English, literature, writing, and then I've always been active in the union. So I combined that union work with my education.
And you taught what?
High school English.
High school English. I'm just curious, we're going to get into a variety of issues relative to current things, but as you look back over that period of time, and when you talk to the teachers as you would from around the state, has teaching changed much over that period of time? You know, a lot of viewers, I think, we remember when we were in high school, and we extrapolate that it's more or less the same thing. And I don't know to what extent there's an intellectual disconnect between what's actually happening today in the classroom and what, you know, I got out of high school in 1973.
Right.
So,
teaching is a much harder profession these days. There are more requirements and paperwork to fill out. And I think the issues of students have really increased.
social problems with
social problems. I look at Springfield alone. I mean, I went to high school here and came back and started teaching at Springfield High School. The poverty level in 1973 was just not what it is today. I mean, today we're looking at almost 68% poverty in our state capital. And so those issues have increased the issues that teachers have to deal with and all staff in buildings. And, you know, some of the rules of testing and all the...
Because we didn't have as much testing back then.
Right.
It was like once a year, as I recall.
Sure, right. So I think that's made it harder. I think there's much more focus on making sure that we are improving and looking at our accountability, tracking each student and what each student needs, and all of that takes just a tremendous amount of time.
And as we sit here today, we hear that there's a shortage of teachers, there's a shortage of substitutes. Are these issues that you've just discussed, is that part of the reason why? I mean, it seems on one hand that teaching would be a good profession to go into and has been, but I'm curious as to why. And apparently it's actually a shortage not just in Illinois, but it's somewhat affecting, I'm told, around the country.
It is around the country. Well, I always found it interesting when I asked my students, do you want to be a teacher? And they say, no. And I said, well, why not? Well, two things, they said. One, you don't make enough money. And two, we don't want to put up with kids like we are. But, you know, discipline, that's just part of what you do. The shortage is really, I think, due to a lot of things. I think people coming into the profession want to really make a difference for students, and that will continue always. But it is a hard profession, and I think people recognize that. I think the attitude about educators and public education has turned off some people in going into the profession, because they turn around everywhere and see their schools being put down. So that has exacerbated the problem. We have students who are studying to be teachers, and they are pretty savvy, and they learn about policy, they learn about pensions, and then when they hear that coming into Illinois they would have to teach until they're 67 and have a reduced pension, some of them say, well, I think I'll go to another state. So, I mean, there are just a lot of factors that are playing into the shortage of teachers. And it's been a problem with some courses like math and science, physics, those. But now it is becoming even more of an issue with other subjects. And so that's something that we continue to talk about, and what are the policies that teachers need so they can be successful with students, and what kinds of support are we giving to our schools, and then how can we help with the attitude about public education. And to me, so many people rely on their public education schools that we have to make sure that we're making them working for everybody.
Is it true, you know, I think people, going back to when they used to enter, they thought that the job was more creative, that they would have more latitude to teach, and they were excited about teaching and sharing information.
Right.
And that, from talking to various teachers, they would say, it's so regulated now, it's like the creativity of the job has been taken away from them and it's too regimented. Is that something you hear?
Oh, I hear that all the time. And let me give you an example of my own experience. Because when we started in the profession, when I did, you were allowed to try a unit, learn from it, and make it better. I did an amazing project with a group of students at Southeast High School. They actually researched a small cemetery that's out at Lake Sandcrest. They did all the research, primary research. They found out who all these people were. They wrote the book for the Department of Conservation, Department of Natural Resources, of who all these people were. And they wrote the feature article about it for the Illinois Times. I look back on that and I realized that that project covered everything in English, from research to writing to reading literature that went along with it. And I don't know if teachers would be given that freedom to use their creativity to take the standards and the benchmarks that are needed in their curriculum and come up with projects. We hear about districts across the state that have a very prescriptive day-to-day curriculum. And so to understand that, it would be that if I were teaching English, I would be told, teach this story on this day and ask these questions. And
so it's a little bit like paint by numbers, huh?
Yeah, and to me that's not teaching. I think today our teachers are finding ways to make sure that we're doing the curriculum as is and adding that creativity, doing community projects with students, so that you really hit the standards and all of the curriculum that's needed without having to have it prescriptive.
Given the state of teaching, are we doing a better job of educating these days, or not as well as maybe we did 30 years ago?
You know, in a way, I think we're doing better because we are more cognizant of all the community issues that our students bring into the schools. The Illinois Education Association has been very active in ACEs, Adverse Childhood Experiences. These issues that students deal with, it might be mental health issues in their home or drug and alcohol abuse in the family.
Now, we didn't have meth 35 years ago,
Yes,
breaking out, right?
Right. And we are now doing a lot of work with our teachers and support staff all across the state on what these adverse childhood experiences do to a student and how that actually creates trauma in their lives. And we have started this project, and I look back on that and think, I wish I had had that 20 years ago, because I realized that there were some students that I was dealing with who obviously, now that I look back on it, we're having major issues. So I think that we have come farther in that, but I do think that the issues that students have and are dealing with just makes it much harder to try to deal with each child and each adult child too in ways that they really need.
You know, we talked about regulation, teaching to the test. All these on one hand might be for a laudable purpose to see we don't want to have people being well educated in one area and completely failing in another, so we're trying to get feedback, right? On the other hand, we often say education is local, predominantly locally funded. They go to their local schools. So how do we balance, given the variance of the lifestyle of a child in Carbondale compared to a child in Chicago? Can you make a standardized, expect a standardized result, I suppose?
Sure.
Is it fair to say, and I don't know if it is or isn't, is it fair to say that everyone should be reading at the same level by the third grade, or is there something wrong with that concept?
Well, first of all, you know, teachers invented tests. So obviously we're not opposed to testing because there is a place for testing. There is a place for a standardized test because it does give you a baseline. The problem that's been created is it's just been over testing. Let's do this one, now let's take this test, now let's do this test. What we want is a system that you're tracking a student's progress. You're looking at how they did on a particular test and then get those results to the teachers so you can individually look at that student and say, okay, this is what this student might need as extra help on this part of the test. So, I mean, to give you an example, we used to have a state writing test, and it was very specific as to what a score meant. When I would get those scores back, I could look at every student's scores and say, this shows me that this student didn't do very well that day on this particular writing in his introduction to his essay. And then I could individualize what he needed to get better. That's what tests should really be used for, that you get that data back, you can look at it, you can assess what other items you need to do in your classroom to make sure students are progressing. But tests got turned into not looking at the student individually and instead started looking at the school or a grade level within a school and comparing one year to the next. That's what No Child Left Behind did. Fortunately, we're getting away from No Child Left Behind and moving to Every Student Succeeds Act.
Is that a better?
Well, it's still being developed.
An improvement, I should say.
It should be better, yes. But it's still being developed as to what will be included and so on. But, you know, I remember a group of students I had who were juniors getting ready to take the ACT test. And the year before, I had had 2 students get a perfect ACT score. So under No Child Left Behind, I knew that the students that year would be compared with the students the next year. And they were talking about, well, taking the ACT. I said, well, you have to do your best. But in order for our school to have looked like we had gone up in ability, 3 students would have needed to get a perfect compared to 2 the previous year. That isn't how you should look at education. It has to be student by student and putting in resources that they need, whether that's special ed, whether that's gifted, whether that's a social worker that can help with an issue they're dealing with coming into the school. I mean, there are just so many aspects that we need to look at.
So much of the conversation we're having in state government in general, of course, naturally goes around the budget, the lack of funding. The governor has increased K-12 education funding. I'm not sure what the current,
Well,
are we at the
let's-
foundation level right now?
Let's address that.
Okay.
I hear a lot of people say K-12 has been increased in funding. The fact of the matter is that we are back to what the funding level was in around 2008. So,
Right, so-
yes, they've
So it's back,
added.
go ahead, I'll let you.
They've added over the last few years, but it's not even where it's supposed to be. So there is an advisory board called Education Foundation Advisory Board that is required by law to look at the per pupil expenditure that the state should be providing. And this is done every 2 years. The advisory board takes a look at a model and indicates to the General Assembly what it is that should be the per pupil expenditure. That recommendation is $9,000. And currently, the state is funding at $6,119. So,
You're close to 3,000,
yes.
close
it
to
would-
$3,000 per pupil, under what
Right.
some people are saying is
Right.
the what you need to
Should be.
spend.
And
I
that's based on,
I would also say, in terms of state funding by a percentage, Illinois is apparently 50th in the nation as far as, on a percentage basis, funding schools. I think
Right.
they're at 45.
well, we're 49th or 50th.
We're 50th. I
Yeah,
don't want to misquote
okay.
the number. But in any event, so we have that funding that's
Right.
at least returned, gone up a
Somewhat.
bit. It hasn't continued to go down as it had been, but we're woefully behind where we were
Very much
15
so.
years ago.
Right. And so what does that mean? It means that costs have gone up and districts are sitting with lack of funding from the state. So that means programs have been cut for students. That means teachers and support staff who are needed have been cut. We have places in the state where class sizes are sitting in the 40s. And
As far as 40 pupils per
40 per, yes. And, you know, I always use the analogy, you wouldn't expect your doctor to see 40 people in an hour.
Let me jump, just because we're always
Yeah.
fighting the clock, even though
Right.
we do a long form. We are talking about changing the funding formula, and one of the problems that Senator Menard would say is that when you predominantly get your funding for education from property taxes, not all communities are created equal.
Correct.
And in rural communities, you don't have the commercial base that you would have in an urban, which makes sense.
Right.
So that school district's automatically not going to be getting the funding level. And in poorer communities, such as in East St. Louis or the South Side Chicago, the property values are going to be low. So under this funding formula, the poor schools remain poor. I mean, they're never going to be funded properly. If he's right in that, what funding formula would work in your estimation?
Well, first of all, freezing property taxes would just make it worse, and that's being discussed. Because if your schools are getting money from property taxes and you freeze that, you've now made that disparity even worse.
Well, they're also talking potentially about shifting
Yes,
the cost shift of taking the pension cost to local school districts.
right,
So if you combine that as an extra cost while you freeze property taxes,
correct,
you're going to have a
Right.
financial problem right there.
right, without more money coming in from the state. So, there's something called evidence-based model, which takes the ingredients that we know through evidence and research help with student achievement, and using a formula, putting money into those areas. So class size might be one, things like that. We really need to get away from funding schools through property taxes, and we need to look at an income tax increase that could offset some of the property tax. But currently, some of the proposals would just cut the property tax And as of yet, we don't have this funding mechanism in place for school funding.
So whether it's a sales tax, as Ralph Martiri might argue, to expand the base of what we're taxing, because we aren't a 1950s economy anymore where we're heavy manufacturing. Whether we have a sales tax or raise the income tax, you would support the idea that if we have a general tax, let's say, of the sort that I just mentioned, then that could be distributed and you're not going to have the poorer districts relying on a poor property tax base.
Yes, what we need to look at are a lot of ideas. It could be a sales tax. It could be an income tax increase. We could move to a progressive income tax. I mean, we're all getting ready to pay our income taxes to the federal government based upon what we make. We could do the same in our state, which would create more revenue. And I know people, you know, would like to have a decrease in their property taxes, but we have to be really careful when we talk about freezing property taxes, knowing that your local schools then might not get the resources that students are needing and teachers are needing to be able to provide the programs. Otherwise, you're going to get right back to more cuts where some of our districts have already made so many cuts that they have nothing else to do. They've cut the arts, they've cut programs, they've cut sports. I mean, we have to have a well-rounded curriculum, and I think that's what the evidence base is doing, is looking at all of those ingredients that really make education work.
One of the conversations we're having, I think increasingly looking at the economy, it seemed before that everyone, you know, in decades past, that we were raising people and everyone was being pushed in to go to higher education. Now, a lot of people are saying we have shortages in the trades. And in Germany, they, I think, at some point segregate so that certain kids are encouraged to go to the trade schools. A lot of the trade schools, a lot of the trades, I should say here, make more money than the people who have gone to college, have some BA degree. They may be making $45,000 and the people in the trades are making $80,000, $100,000 or $120,000. How do you see that, and should we consider at some point identifying kids that are maybe college qualified, or how do we handle that as a society where we say some people might really do better in going into those trades as compared to going and being a mediocre student and doing a mediocre job with a college education?
Well, I had an amazing opportunity to go to Finland in last September. Finland is considered the #1 school system in the world. And they look at vocational education and college education as equal in need and equal for anyone who wants to go in either route. It is not a stigma to go into vocational, and they don't separate just on your ability. It is a very unique system that they have that is based totally on equity and funding. So at grade 9, the end of 9th grade, students decide if they want to take college route courses or vocational courses. Whatever they choose is considered fine. It is not one is better than the other. And then their high school, I would liken it to our community college. The students are taking classes based upon which route that they want to go, what career they're looking at. And then they have one test out of all of their years. When they have finished those courses, it's called their matriculation exam. So I think there are some countries that do separate people, and they look at their ability and their whether they're special ed or not. That's not the way to do it. It's really to look at what does the student need, what is the student interested in, and help with getting to a career.
You know, I should have asked this question earlier, but given your 44 years of experience in the educational industry, if it were up to you, what changes would you make to the system?
If I were in charge?
Yeah.
Well, first of all, I would bring a lot of people together with real experience and expertise and talk about what are the ingredients we want out of our schools. That's what Finland did in the 1970s. Then I would look at all of those pieces. I think the problem that we have in education in our state and around the country is that somebody comes up with an idea and says, oh, let's try this. And there's no thinking about how that affects everything else in education. Education is not simple. It's very complicated. From your curriculum to who becomes a teacher, to what are the standards that we're going to have in the curriculum, to what happens every day in a school, to what does it mean when you get a diploma. And when you sit down and you look at, so we have a wide variety of students from all levels of ability and walks of life. And what is it that we need to have in our schools so that our students are successful? And then we need to have a conversation about equity. Finland is, every school is funded equally. And we have to have a conversation about trust.
I might insert here that I heard just today, earlier, that our spending varies from about $4,800 per pupil to $28,000 per pupil.
Yes.
Speaking about
Right.
equity.
Right.
And you say you needed also trust. I'm sorry.
Trust. I think what I noticed in Finland and in many countries, by the way, that I've not had a chance to visit but have heard about, is that educators are trusted, respected, and looked to as experts. And when I look at the members that we have in IEA, 133,000, and I have visited schools across this state, I'm just amazed at the people that we have in our schools working with students. And whenever there's been a chance for business people, community leaders to come in, I know Springfield has a day where business people come into the classroom or spend a day with the principal. Almost everyone has walked out saying, I had no idea how great our schools are. So bring the right people together, come up with the right plans together, trust the people who are in the schools working, and provide the resources so they can do their job.
You know, it also occurs to me when you're talking about different Finland and different places, sometimes when we will look, as an example, I was told some years ago that South Korea has about 1/6 of our population but produces as many engineers as the United States, which is a problem for the United States. On the other hand, that said, it seems to me that sometimes when we are looking at testing and we look at math scores and science and economics, that there's something that's hard to test, and that's creativity.
Right.
And when we look at the United States, our culture is dominant around the world. Our music, our movies, our literature. These are not mathematical, technical skills.
Correct.
And sometimes, are we missing that? I don't mean to be making your argument for you, but that's also a part of just how do we calculate? Everyone knows some people are very creative and other people are more analytical.
Right.
And
Right.
it's kind of the luck of the draw, the way your brain's wired, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's definitely true. We have to look at each person and make sure that there are resources so they can move in the direction into a career that they want. You know, you don't want to go overboard where there's so much pressure on a student. I mean, I think some countries kind of go there. So much pressure, even
the Asian countries especially,
in kindergarten. Right? But what I think is prevalent in a lot of those countries, is that education is considered very important. And the emphasis for students to get an education is constantly talked about. And what, unfortunately, we have a lot of happening in our country is to put down schools, to put down educators, to say things aren't any good. I mean, that's happening with the new U.S. Secretary of Education.
And in fact, thank you for bringing it. I wanted to ask about that. I mean, she has been a proponent for years, Betsy DeVos of School of Choice. She, from Detroit area, and obviously the Detroit schools, there are a lot of urban schools around the United States that are just failing, where they're not sufficiently educating the kids. In those instances, and we can pick our troubled area around the country, what's wrong with saying, if you're in a failing school, rather than being forced to stay in a failing school and basically having your future stolen from you, you can take the money that we would have spent on education, or you can take 75% of the money, or whatever the deal is, and go to the school of your choice. What's wrong with that?
Well, first of all, I think the rhetoric that's a failing school is not correct. I think there could be aspects that aren't reaching students. But I then ask, why is that? Is it because the money has not been put into the programs? Is it because that we need to work on parental involvement? I mean, so that's the first piece I would say. Second is, school choice is a nice name that doesn't mean what it sounds like it means. School choice is a way for certain groups to take advantage of parents, etc., and trying to segregate our schools. So giving money to several parents or a group of parents to send their child to another school means that you're now actually funding two systems, the public and the private. And what we need to be thinking about is what kinds of resources are going into that public school to improve it, rather than take people out of it and let it possibly get worse because you have fewer students there or programs that can be offered.
Wouldn't there be an argument to be made, though, that as we talked earlier in the conversation, that the problem with a number of these schools, in fact, back in 2003, I did a story on Washington, D.C. schools. At the time, they were spending $13,000 a year per pupil, which is among the highest around the nation. And 75% of the students were performing below basic, which meant they're functionally illiterate, basically. So that money, if you have these schools where the children come from very troubled areas, where the social fabric is more or less broken down, and we see that in the South Side Chicago with what's happening with the crime levels, isn't in the argument to say teachers can't do where society has already failed all these people for whatever reasons, the parents and everyone else. We can't expect teachers to make up in 8 hours a day the failures of the rest of society.
Teachers alone and the school system alone cannot do it by themselves.
So in that instance, would choice be an option to say, let's put them to where they could, of their choosing, go to a school that where it may be not as dysfunctional?
Again, if I were in charge, I would pull the community members together and say, what is it we need to work on so that we can help every student in this school? You take out a few students and they might get a choice to go somewhere else. What are you doing with the rest of the students? Why aren't you working on a way to bring that school up, put in the needed ideas that are going to help those students? I mean, it might be that you have to look at what the curriculum is. It might be you have to look at how are we reaching out to parents. It might be that they need some after-school programs to help these students. It might be to bring in ACEs. But weeding out a few isn't going to address making that school better.
What if there is a different approach, and well, time's running short, but there are, I think, some systems where school districts contract with private contractors and basically say, we can't educate these kids for whatever reason. And then instead of that child being mainstreamed with the rest of the class, they get more individualized attention, which is also, I mean, to the extent that we have now in the last 10 years, the explosion of technology where we can have iPads and all the rest and the internet and watching all this videos. There's a whole another hour we could probably spend talking about how is technology impacting the classroom.
Right.
Do you think, and again, to remind the audience, it's not just you, but you represent this coalition of all this experience in dealing with all the teachers you talk to. What about when you have these children who are disrupting the learning environment in the classroom, saying, well, what are we going to do with them? Instead of just expelling them, but maybe having a private contractor say, okay, you take the worst of the worst and spend more time with them, but we can teach the rest of the kids, and you spend more time on that. Is that a viable option? Is that an alternative to school choice?
I think that weeds out students who need a lot of help. And, you know, the most important thing for a student is a caring adult. And in our schools, we have caring adults. So just saying this student is not making it, we're going to put them into a private company who's going to, you know, maybe have them sit in front of a computer and do things, to me isn't the answer. To me, it is who are the people in that school who can reach that student and help them get better. And I think that's what our teachers are trying to do every day. But what they ask for is the support to be able to do that and to be able to tap into some community help and to have the personnel to deal with that. You know, I could think of students who did not do well, who created problems, but just shipping them off was not the answer. It was really working with them and their families, and I think a lot more outreach with families is needed that could bring them into doing what they need to do. And yes, you're going to have some students who are beyond the discipline and have to be dealt with and whatever issues there are. But we also have a new state law that prevents just expelling or suspending students without looking at some things you can do before you get to that stage.
Let me have one last question. This is probably, it may not even be on your radar, but in talking to the management side, the school board members and some of the school administrators and those associations, one of their great frustrations is in Illinois we passed the budget, including education, when we do pass a budget, at the end of May. They say it's too late for them to be making intelligent decisions.
Right.
Sometimes they may be telling teachers, we're going to have to lay you off because they don't know what finances they're going to have. Would the IEA be in favor of saying to the legislature, why don't we pull education, at least K-12 education, out separately from your budgetary process and say, let's pass that portion by April 1? Would that make sense to you?
Well, I haven't thought about that before, but they have kind of done that with their stopgap budget. But here's what I would say about that. I don't think education should be separated from all the other things in our state, because there are so many aspects of state budget that impacts education. So, for instance, when you cut family service agencies, that impacts what we can do in our schools. We have more that we need to take up the slack. When you cut, Department of Natural Resources or any of these, state-funded items, those are places where students may be going to get jobs. We have to take a comprehensive look at our budget because education is so tied to what students are going to go into in their careers, colleges they might want to go to, that I think just separating us out is is not going to get us where we really want to be. I think we have to look at the resources, the funding, the right kind of funding, and promote public education for what it really does for students. And when you ask people, who is your favorite teacher or who is the teacher who made the difference, it's somebody who cared and helped a student think through their future. So I don't know if separating it out would help.
All right, well, Cinda Klickna, we spent more time than we already expected.
Oh, really? Thank you.
Congratulations on
Thank
your
you.
career, and
Thank you.
good luck in your approaching retirement. We'll
Yeah.
hopefully see you around.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.